Welcome to the Adoption Curve, the show where we explore how leading organizations are transforming their approach to turn technology adoption into a strategic advantage. In each episode, we'll sit down with a learning and enablement practitioner to get their inside story on how they're helping their organizations adopt and maximize their technology investments. Let's dive into today's episode. Nick, welcome to the show.
Sean, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I was looking through some of my saved LinkedIn posts the other day, and I had like 20 that were all your posts. I was like, I should probably have this guy on the show to actually share some of this stuff, because I feel like I'm consuming so much of your content and then it's going into a black hole and not being reshared out there to as many people as possible. You do a tremendous job of kind of downloading things and making them concise and sharing them back out there for the world. So I want to have you on to really talk about that. But to level set, give us a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into this revenue enablement space, which is a little new for our audience.
Yeah, sure. I started off in sales, and right before I was like transitioning into a more account executive type of role, I started in the current role that I was in, it was more of like a support function, supporting a lot of our, the partners that would resell our software. And a lot of like portions of that job were like teaching and enabling the partners on how to like sell our product. And I found myself really gravitating to like that. I just really loved every aspect of that. Or I would look for opportunities in order to go and visit the partner sites and try to, train them up on being able to sell our products. And then so when I was gearing up for a promotion, I started thinking about where did I want to take my career? And luckily around the same time, a spot on our enablement team opened up, and I thought that seems totally relevant to, what I really enjoy doing most in this current role. So was able to luckily get my foot in the door that way, and immediately was just kind of captivated by all things enablement. I knew it was a right fit right away.
Love that. Where do you draw the line or definition wise? I know you have some background in L&D. We have a lot of folks who are learning first as practitioners. Where do you see the line between something like an educator, enablement, learning? Like, what are those differentiators for you?
That's such a hard question because enablement has become quite a bit of like an umbrella term. And so there are many factors of performance, and a lot of times enablement does kind of get boxed into like the knowledge and skill team. And I feel like that's like slowly changing, especially like you were just referring to it as a revenue enablement. I feel like that's, more of a concept where we're trying to branch out of there, but it's definitely, it's been a challenge even for me in my own career as to like how I've evolved from my initial thinking. Was I originally was certified as like an instructional designer. So I saw every problem as a knowledge gap, as a knowledge problem. Like, oh, they just don't know enough. Oh, they haven't been trained enough. So like if they just knew this, or if they were trained, we'd see an improvement. And it took me, a few years to evolve into, it's not necessarily what they know, it's what they do. And then even that eventually changed from now into like a more like performance consulting type of world, where it's just like, oh, it's not necessarily, what they do is of course important, but ultimately it's like what they produce and accomplish on the job is the most important. And when you start looking at the things that they actually have to be producing and accomplishing, you start seeing a lot more than the individual performer. Right? So a lot of your attention, or at least your eyes kind of get opened to like, oh, there's a lot of other things at play here other than the individual. There's a lot more of a focus on the actual environment that the individual is working on. So yeah, to answer your question, it's a hard one. Like, where do you draw those lines? It's very tricky, especially with so many go-to-market supporting functions in place, from sales ops to enablement and so on.
Yeah, totally fair. I like that you use the word consulting, because I really do think that is one of the ones I find that paints the better picture. We talk, a lot with customer ed and L&D folks about they get viewed as kind of a supporting function internally. Oh, we need this thing created. Let's just like go to the internal resources to get that done. And of course, we're trying to like undo some of those bad behaviors, become a business partner in the organization. The best enablers that I've seen have really taken, to your point, that consulting role, where their sort of ability to zoom outward a bit, look at the holistic picture, identify the friction points, figure out like where and what outcome are we achieving, who and what do we need to remove? Are there things that need to be built? Is that like empowering and partnering with instructional design teams? Is that a soft skill training? Is that maybe like drilling down on process in some ways? Like there's so many parts that go into something like that. I think they get attached to revenue quicker because they're viewed as more of a consulting service internally. And I think because of that, it's like easier to measure versus learning.
Yeah.
Although I would say the functions are quite similar. I don't know your thoughts on that, but that's kind of like some of the definitions we've been playing around with.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And sometimes being labeled as like a support or like a, being an order taker gets a bad rap. Ultimately, what we're going to be doing is receiving orders. I would say if you're not receiving orders and supporting the business, it's like something's wrong. They like if you're getting orders, that's a good thing. And one of the things that another performance consultant, Guy Wallace, I've learned a lot from him. I've got one of his books on my desk right now. One of the quotes I took away from him was, the problem isn't being an order taker, it's the process that follows. That's the problem. So it's like, what do you do after you receive an order? And so exactly to what you were just referring to is a lot of people fall into the check the box mentality. And that's where the problem lies. Whereas after you receive an order, what do you do with it? Like, what is the process you take in order to uncover what problems we're trying to solve and how to specifically solve those? That's where the ultimate, I think, problem lies.
It reminds me so much of like what happens in a sales process too. We have the folks who are effectively order takers, right? I come to the website and I go, I want this widget. I have 12 people at my company that want it, right? And the salesperson on the other side, they type up the order and they do the demo and they deliver it, right? And like where you see the gap for like the enterprise level, the big motions, the big initiatives that get accomplished are those that take a consulting role, right? They are unpacking and prescriptively describing objections, and they're coming and bridging gaps that the buyer in that case didn't even know to think about, right? I've seen that from enablers as well, where they're like, yeah, I think what you're looking for as an outcome is there, but like you're missing this other piece, or like maybe we could think about this holistically, this other program that's going on internally. Any of that resonate? Because that's been something we've been trying to point to good examples in other departments, because sometimes the lines get blurred.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think part of the like a big problem is not defining what gaps you solve and having the solutions for those gaps. That's a big one. That was actually one of my most recent posts was, if like I was outlining, what different gaps are and like how do you actually like fill them. Like a training gap, for an example, most of the requests Enablement receives is this broad general term of we need to enable the field or we need to train the field. Those are the two umbrella terms that we typically presented with. And the problem with that is like those are that doesn't give us any clarity around the gaps we're trying to solve. To me, training fills a skills gap, which means you need practice. That's very different from a traditional just like stand up webinar or session, or whatnot. So being very clear with the list of skill or the list of gaps that are typically present and what solution you employ to solve that gap, I think is very important, not only for enablement to define, but also to socialize with their stakeholders so that the stakeholders can be able to see and understand the full breadth of what enablement can help with, and also getting a little bit more like specific with what problems it is that we're trying to address.
Again, the zooming out piece to try to get to the end outcome. Yeah. You talk a lot in your content around, competency or competent versus competencies. Can you like describe that thing? I think it's a good frame up for a lot of what we're looking to cover here, especially in the lens of adoption.
Yeah, sure. So competencies are the traits or the skills, the knowledge that people possess. Of course, those are important, but the problem with focusing in on competencies is they are a means to an end. They're not the end itself. And what happens a lot of times is they're treated as the end. And so you take a list of general competencies or traits that you want your people to have. Oftentimes people will build exhaustive lists of, a whole competency map. But the problem is without context as to how, where, when, why to apply those competencies or those traits and skills, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to apply them in the right way. And like another way of thinking about competencies is even if you could get all of your reps to 100% on all of the competencies on your list. So what can you reliably say about your impact on performance? There really isn't like too much you can say other than like, oh, look, we developed their active listening, or, now they're active listeners. It's like, yeah, but what, like, show me how that impacted things. So the flip side then is focusing on competence. Competence is just the work that they produce and accomplish. So there's obviously going to be a set of deliverables or outputs that reps need to be producing, ranging from an account plan or a point of view, business case, proposals. These are, things that they actually have to produce to a certain standard in order to accomplish certain outcome. And so by definition, they're inherently valuable. When people produce their work to a certain standard, they are competent. And so that is where I think enablement needs to be focusing their time and attention on. Are they competent? Can they produce the work we want them to be producing? And of course, competencies are going to maybe be a part of that, right? So in order to produce any one of those competencies, in order to produce any one of those outputs, you're going to need certain competencies, right? But you're also going to need a lot more. There's going to be a process and resources and incentives that you also need to be considering. But the goal, and even more importantly, is when you end up educating or training your sales reps on those competencies, it's in the context of producing that work. Because again, if you learn something, but you learn it not in the context of how to apply it, the chances of you applying it correctly, right, of that transferring over to the job, are so minimal, right? So when you are so that's just like another value point of doing that, is when you're trying to enable them to produce certain work, you're obviously going to define what competencies they need, but they're learning them in that context of doing their job.
Yeah. Again, back to the point of beginning with the end in mind, zooming outward. What are we trying to accomplish from an output standpoint? We can work backwards to insert what skills and competencies we need to actually accomplish to have, but them in isolation alone doesn't accomplish much, right? Like if I'm just abstractly trying to learn Spanish on Duolingo, but I'm not really ever doing anything with it until I'm dropped into Mexico, and now I'm like using it, and man, do you pick up things on the job, and man, do you know how to apply it, and does that actually stick in your brain? Because there's application and context and all these sort of things that are not just a skill that's floating out there in the ether, it's actually, directly applied. So I'm sure there's many organizations, and we see this all the time, where they're floating in that competency world, and there's some initiative out there that says like, build better discovery. We got to ask better questions, right? And it's just like a rudimentary thing that isn't tied to an objective. So like, what are your frameworks? What are your thought processes for those that are in the former camp and they're trying to get to that competent camp?
Well, I think it all starts with just like defining it, right? If you're the first step in being able to improve performance is being able to define performance. Mm-hmm. And the way I define performance is the outcomes and outputs, right? So there are a set of outcomes that they need to be accomplishing. Those are obviously related to pipeline generation, opportunity conversion, win rates, deal length. So you're going to have these outcomes that you want them to be accomplishing. And then based upon those outcomes that you want them to be accomplishing, now you start identifying, okay, what are then the deliverables? What work do they need to produce in order to accomplish, those outcomes? And so again, the first step in being able to make that transition is to just like start working with the right stakeholders to define and map out what are those outcomes. And then once you validate you've got the outcomes right, it's like then you start mapping it out. An easy way to do this is just if you just map out the typical sales process, you'll start to find out like what are the deliverables that people need to be, producing, and when they need to be producing them, right? So like you mentioned discovery, like asking better questions and things like that. But it's like, what is like discovery ultimately is a process. Like what's produced at the like when you're doing proper discovery. Of course, there's going to be maybe a few things, but one example could be a current state assessment, right? So it's like you've developed or you've produced like this current state assessment. It would be like this tangible thing that can be inspected, that can be looked at, that could be shared. And importantly, all of these outputs that you're defining should be coming with like a set of standards. Here's what good looks like. Here's how we know and here's how we're going to be able to tell a good one from a bad one. So that's an example of what a specific output might look like. And of course, it's going to be directly tied and anchored to the outcomes that you want to be achieving as well.
Yeah. So defining those outcomes is step one, right? That should be the simplest of the processes. Hopefully leadership has some initiatives down on driving pipeline or revenue attention or retention of some kind, whatever those metrics happen to be. If it's not something specific to sales, same thing in broadly some other kind of metric that they're tracking. So we're recognizing the outcome that we want to achieve. We're then breaking down the sets of steps or the sets of programs or deliverables that need to be built within those. I'd be curious how you think about the choosing of those deliverables, because I could see very much it being like, oh, but I saw this LinkedIn post that said that we should be doing this tactic with this tool and then this thing. And then you have like a million different sub-components. Like, how do you think about how to not get distracted by like the endless components that might actually move you away from the end core objective we're trying to get to?
Yeah, that's a hard one. And it's something I'm still working through myself. And the stuff we're working through at Databricks is how do we make sure that we're defining the core set of outputs. Currently, we're doing that on like a kind of like a program by program basis, but where we would love to be able to get to like a place is developing an actual like performance model for a role, right? So the role itself has the defined set of outcomes that they're associated to and the defined set of outputs that are most important, that are most valuable for them to be producing. And so the way in which you would like define, in which you would select those is, like you said, that could get overwhelming very quickly. The list could start getting very huge. So you want to make sure that you're selecting the absolute like essential, the most valuable assets or again deliverables that are most dependent on those outcomes being accomplished, right? So the larger, the more critical. So again, there's more of a art than a science to that, to be able to selecting them. However, the more you connect yourself with stakeholders with a lot of experience going through the selling motion, I think a problem with doing this approach is a lot of sales leaders or people in sales ops, they've done this before, right? They've mapped out the sales process before, but the way they typically do it is they typically do it with like a set of like activities, right? A lot of you'll see like by selling stage and they'll be able to list out like certain activities they must do. Of course, activities are going to be important. What you want to be eventually trying to guide them to is being able to define after they do those activities, right? What's left behind? What is the rep after actually like produce? Like if the rep left the company tomorrow, what would they have left behind? There's something tangible there that you could look at, you can inspect it. And that's whatever the most important critical aspects are in order to hit those key milestones and accomplish those outcomes that you've defined, narrow in on those. But yeah, to your point, it's definitely important that you don't overwhelm yourself biting off more than you can chew with, a list of 30 or more, outputs, and it just starts to get a little unmanageable for sure.
I'd also like to call out that in this entire conversation so far, we have not mentioned tools or technology yet, right?
Yeah.
So like, we're not starting with Salesforce. We're not starting with insert the blank piece of tech and going like, hey, that's the strategy, right? Like I see this constantly. Well, we bought the ERP. Well, we bought this thing. Well, we have Gong. That's not a strategy, right? Like some people don't buy the tooling they buy the house, right? They buy the outcome. They buy raising their family and starting a thing. They don't buy a hammer, right? And so it's what the tool helps them to accomplish. So we talk a ton on the show, obviously, about digital adoption, the concept of like how we have these tools get unlocked, but it's not unique to the tools. It's also to the process. It's also to helping us get that end outcome. We've broken it down to like, here's the outcomes that we want to have. We've outlined the deliverables and the components that we want to have. Now we start bringing in the tooling to start to maybe take place and handle or automate or support some of those things. How do you think about that as an enabler just broadly when tools start to get into the mix?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, great question. Again, using the outputs, the outcomes and the outputs in order to guide your thinking. So the full framework that I use is outcomes, outputs, and obstacles. And that third part is really important because it helps enablement branch out of just like that knowledge and skill box. And by obstacles, there's typically like a set of obstacles or means that need to be in place that performance really, really depends on. Of course, process is going to be, but this is relevant for each individual output as well. So pick any output that you want, whether it's an account plan or a point of view or a current state to future state analysis, business proposal, whatever it is, whatever that is, some of the primary ones include, so obviously there's like a process in order to produce that, but then like are expectations clear, right? So our expectations around what good looks like are those standards easily found and are people aware of those standards? Things like feedback. Do people even know, like after they do something, how do they know they did a good job? How is something, are they getting confirmed or guiding? Is there some type of confirmation or guidance after they produce that work? And then simple things like, do they have the right information and resources they need to produce that output? Where and when they need it. Even things like incentives are important to be thinking about. And then finally, you get into the individual factors like motivation, knowledge, and skills. Do they have the prerequisite knowledge and skills they need in order to produce that output? So for each individual output, there's almost like this system like around it that depends. Like if you really want that work to be produced to standard consistently and at scale, you have to think of that. You have to kind of take that environment-based approach, viewing those things as from like a more like a systems-based approach, and thinking about all of the factors that depend on whether or not those outputs are being produced to the standard you want them being produced to. And so one of the factors, of course, is like when you're thinking about, okay, how do we ensure that they're able to produce this output to the certain standard? Of course, one of the things that's going to come up is like which systems and tools also are available for them to produce this work. And that's again, what's so beneficial about outlining that performance model, the outcomes and the outputs, is you actually get to see where are the gaps, right? When you actually list those out, the gaps start popping out of like what actually needs to be put in place. And tooling, of course, is a critical aspect to help, whether you're guiding the process or guiding the performer through the process. There are, of course, helpful tools in order for them to do that. And just by defining what it is they need to do, what their expectations are, you can obviously much easier identify not only the specific tools you need, but then the use cases for those tools as well, so that you're actually driving adoption of the tools.
I like that. Yeah. And I just like that we're spending so much time on the strategy before we get to picking up the tool, logging into the thing, executing the task, and showing how it cohesively fits into the overall objective or the outcome that we're trying to put forth. I want to have you speak more about the kind of this digital enablement environment. You were talking about thinking about that as a systems thinker, first principles, really strategizing around that, not so much always clicks on a screen, but like true systems thinking. What else can you share around that? Because I know this is a big part of kind of your methodology.
Yeah, I think it stems from, I think, one of the biggest challenges or with how a traditional enablement kind of approaches things. The way it's often set up and traditional enablement operates is an event-based approach to develop knowledge and skills. And by events, I mean things like courses, training events, webinars, whatever, like these individual events meant to, again, develop or like share information, develop knowledge, try to develop skills. So that's typically the general approach. And what I advocate for is more of like an environment-based approach to improve performance. And again, I think that just comes down to like thinking about enablement for how it's truly defined. When you actually look up the definition of enablement, it's something along the lines of providing somebody with the means to do something. And that word means is obviously really important. That's where all of those obstacles I just talked about, the expectations, feedback, information, resources, incentives, knowledge, skills, right? Those are all the means that enable somebody to do something. But the problem is enablement often falls and kind of just like narrows in on just one of the more like lower leverage and difficult to change means as well, which is knowledge and skills. I think they're of course very important, but when we're thinking about like a performance problem, like people aren't performing to a certain standard, it's most likely an environmental problem. And so it's more advanced, and it's oftentimes a little bit less calories in order to solve the environmental problem than it is to truly develop like a large audience's knowledge and skills, like across the board to get them performing. So again, it's just like a lower leverage approach to try to focus in on like, let's use events to develop knowledge and skills. It's much more, I think, like just easier, advantageous, more efficient and effective to focus on the environment and really honing in on like what it is we want them to do. Okay, going back to the second part of the definition there of enablement, providing people with the means to do something. That something is producing those outputs. It's doing their work, producing their work. So how do we ensure that we're providing them with all of the means they need to produce their work? And so that's, I feel like, encapsulates the environment-based approach like well, just like thinking about that definition of enablement.
Yeah. Any examples that come to mind in recent projects in terms of the environment over an event?
Yeah, sure. We're working on one now with our I'll think of a good example here. One of the more recent ones was, obviously we have our large customer conference coming up, and so this is just like another example of all of the things that we're trying to think about outside of just like the traditional like knowledge at events. So what we're doing is, like, of course we're packaging up like a program to enable the field, but we're making sure that there are very clear expectations around, of course, like what they need to be doing. And also thinking about things broader than just, there's of course events associated with it, but there's obviously other things that we're going to be trying to accomplish as well, ranging from, leveraging, like, there's certain like AI tools that we're using in order for them to identify and personalize in like who should be going to what sessions. How do we, driving attendance to specific sessions? So we have that paired with certain outbound campaigns, paired with certain dashboards for them to be constantly, following up on. We're using on-demand, so we use Udly for our on-demand, AI role plays and tutors. So we're having that. So just thinking about things more all-encompassing as opposed to just like the traditional, like, let's have one event on here and then wipe our hands clean and kind of move on to the next.
Yeah. Especially if we're talking about driving home, a particular outcome there, whether it's something like pipeline out of an event or, success on whatever that particular initiative is. Not saying, okay, well, we'll have a 30-minute meeting. We'll get everybody in there, and then we'll just talk at them with a couple of slides, and then they'll have everything they need to know, and then, we'll hope for the best, right? Versus this environment where we're effectively letting them pull versus push, right? Not pushing stuff on them, but letting them pull as it's appropriate. This reminds me of a lot of what we see in the just-in-time enablement field, specifically with tech as well, is like hitting people when they're in that flow of like, if you train me on some click path or some process now, and I'm not going to use it for 3 months because I'm not ready for it, it's not going to stick, right? But now I'm actually like live on site, and I need to remember, like, how do I pull up that one summary, or how do I surface X, Y, and Z? The time of need is there, right? And then I'm able to pull it in, and I'm really interested and motivated at that point to do those sort of things. So is that kind of what you're describing in terms of like aligning the initiative with like an incentive and the timeliness?
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it for sure. It's just making sure that when and where they need to do something, right there, the resources are there for them. And that includes task support, like just-in-time resources, or even just like a simple, like a prompt, as in a reminder or notification, like something that, so you mentioned push versus pull. That alone is so useful to be able to figure out, like, in what context are they supposed to be doing something, producing something? Can we proactively push something or prompt them, remind them in order to do it? And here are the resources to do it. That alone is so useful, because part of the problem with driving change is recognizing when and where to apply certain knowledge, or to do something, to perform certain tasks, do a certain behavior, produce certain work. Again, part of the challenge there is getting people to recognize when they're supposed to do it. And that's often like an afterthought. And so being able to put those types of resources in that context is extremely helpful.
Speaking of the change management concept in general, obviously the resistance here, the general skepticism around this, like, hey, follow this thing or you're going to get fired. Like, that's one incentive. Sure.
Yeah.
But moreover, like, how do we make this truly aligned to the professional? Like, what does that incentive process look like? Any advice for those things when we're rolling out programs?
Yeah, the incentives are tricky. I mean, everybody typically goes to like financial incentives, but those aren't, obviously that's not scalable or possible to financially incentivize everybody. There's like 4 criteria that you can use to make sure that an incentive is going to work. It has to be either very like significant or timely, right? So if it's not very significant to the person, it at least needs to be timely, and vice versa. If it's not immediate, it needs to be significant. So it needs to be one of those two. It also helps to be very likely and tangible, or some combination there. If it's not very likely, it needs to be very tangible. If it's not tangible, it needs to be very likely. Across those dimensions, like, is this incentive significant and timely? Is it tangible or likely? Those are things that are that's just like a useful framework to make sure that people are actually going to be willing to work for or do the work, essentially.
I think that's a good framework to pull from. Have you seen any success with championing, like pulling in someone internally or someone who's nailing down and really has adopted this early as an early adopter, using them as the story to kind of like, this is what good looks like. I want to follow behind the top performer. Anything like that's happened in your experience?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, we of course have access to a lot of performance data at Databricks, and one of the things we definitely try to do a lot of is try to identify who those top performers are, whether they're the sales leader or individual contributors and performers, and we'll highlight the fact that they are like whatever it is we're asking you all to do. This is somebody who does it really well, and those are typically the people we'll pull in to try to influence the design of whatever interventions we need early on, and also be able to just drive that communication from a standpoint of credibility as well.
Yeah. As we're wrapping up here, on the measurement side, anything else you'd add there other than just the data of what success looks like? Any best practices or frameworks around thinking about measurement, about how to think about that?
Yeah, I mean, measurement is, of course, a really tricky problem to solve. We're like in this muddy, messy phase of like working it out, like even here. But one of the most important pieces of advice, I think I would say, for enablement folks is to try to deconstruct performance down to what you can reliably influence, like with credibility. Like an example would be, if you say something like we generated pipeline, like something like conversion, that's going to be hard for you. Like, it's going to be hard for you to like hang your hat on. But if you can get a little bit more granular, like if you can deconstruct that down into things that you can more reliably influence, things like, are they engaging with our ICP or with our like ideal buyer personas? So if you have a way to track like engagement across different accounts or personas, is that a metric that that's like more of a metric that you can influence? Or even things like call connects or email replies, things like that, where you can more reliably say we influence these things. And so not only is that going to help you identify and be able to, tie your initiatives to actual metrics, it's going to help you like narrow in on what the specific problems are and more reliably help you find and identify what those outputs are that you need to be like honing in on and focusing in on. Because again, part of the problem is trying to identify what those outputs might be. And so the more granular you can get and specific you can get with like, what is the specific metric that we want to try to influence here? What work then does the field need to be producing in order for that to be happening? And then you just base your enablement program around that work so that influenceable outcome changes or gets improved. And then now you're finally on your way to, actually proving your impact.
Yeah. I would also say, don't be afraid of the qualitative data. I think we all focus a lot on the quantitative, and we want some percentage number that shows that we did this thing and it equaled this much pipeline or this much percentage of improvement. And like, that's fantastic. It's not always the case. It's usually a little bit more fuzzy than that. And, one of the things that's really difficult, especially when you're talking about empowering or enabling people to do things, is sometimes it's anecdotal. Like, they just got to the outcome quicker and better and with less friction because of your systems and your enablement. That's a hard thing to measure, but sometimes we pull things like, call intelligence, feedback post sales as well, of like, yeah, the rep told me this template and like painted this picture very specifically, showed me this use case in this example from a case study that was very aligned to what we needed. Like that alone was like a big buying signal from them. That was a big motivator. You can't tie, ARR to that particularly, but you certainly can say because of the enablement that was put in place, there was like a smoothing mechanism to the sales process. Like we hear this a lot with at IRAD, like, yeah, I just hear less complaints from my learners. Like that's not really can't rack like tickets and like inbound, sure, yeah. But sometimes it's just like their experience was better. I don't know. Like, and you can't get them to, like, the learner doesn't describe it. They don't really know why, but they know that they did learn it, So like anything else you'd add there, just in those thoughts of like the slippery ones to wrap your arms around?
No, the qualitative feedback is obviously useful as well. There's a good book called The Success Case Method by Robert Brinkerhoff. And for anybody that is in the early stages of trying to prove enablement's impact, that's a good reference because it explains what you're talking about. Where after any type of program that you launch, you keep an eye on like how people are doing, and you find out like who's doing well, who improved, and you go to those people and you say, hey, tell me about the impact this program made on your success, and you just get that qualitative like feedback. And then same thing with if there's other people that saw no improvement or got worse, you can go to those people and say, what could have we done better? But just by going to the people that benefited the most, or the people that didn't benefit at all, or like saw worse results. If you take both of that qualitative data to an executive and you said, here's what we heard went really well, here's what we found is going to do better, you're going to earn a lot of like credibility there beyond just showing data that, who knows, maybe they're less trustworthy in that.
Also, you can tap into people's emotions. They see a customer's face light up on a video. They read a transcript. They see an email. Sometimes that makes a bigger difference than like 32% of blah 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 did this, and this. That kind of stuff sometimes resonates a little bit more with the human side of this. In closing here, any other thoughts if you're speaking to the tech side of this? Obviously, we talk to a lot of SaaS companies and companies that are implementing or trying to figure out how to scale AI and these other tools and like achieve these outcomes. Just like how anything we didn't cover on just that ability to zoom out. I think we all get very, very fixated on clicks and actions and workflows and the latest and greatest template and prompt. Like any other closing thoughts on that of like why it's important to have a holistic strategy and not just let's buy this tool and you're going to get to achieved outcome?
Yeah. I guess I'll end with another quote from Guy Wallace. It was, if we're not improving the performance of the target audience, why bother? And again, if you haven't taken the steps to define performance, it's very hard for you to tell me what your plan is to improve it. So I think it's very important to get very granular and specific with how you define performance. You see this all the time with whether it's a vendor or an onboarding program that claims that they reduce ramp time, but they can't define ramp or sales productivity. It's like, well, what are you saying? What are you even saying? So it's like, you have to define what these things are. And it does take time. It takes like a very proactive and kind of even like aggressive approach to try to get the stakeholder buy-in in order to do this, to get these things defined, get them locked in. And even if it's like for enablement's own benefit. So it's never like it's never like formalized or standardized across the org. Just the process of defining and figuring out what are the outcomes that we want to be driving, even if you never measure them, and then going the step down and be like, okay, well, what work do they have to produce in order to accomplish those outcomes? Again, even if you never have any mechanism to assess if they're actually producing that work, it's going to improve everything you do because you'll just have a direction and you'll have a definition of what do we mean by performance. Performance is producing these outputs to accomplish these outcomes. And then you're on your way to try to figure out what are the obstacles in the way that are preventing people from doing that. It could be a tool, it could be something else, but at least you have that direction.
Said, love that. Fantastic. Nick, this was great. Thank you for taking some time to kind of share your insights here. Like I mentioned, you prolifically share on LinkedIn. What else? What are the resources? Where can we point people to learn more about you?
Still just LinkedIn right now. Yeah, I'm on no other social media because I spend enough time on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Okay. You mentioned some great quotes, Guy Wallace, a number of other books there. So we'll link to all that so people can take a look. And we'll link to everything that Nick has to say as well. And some of his posts, you can check those out. So again, Nick, thanks for being here. We appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Adoption Curve. If you've enjoyed today's conversation and want more content like this, I highly recommend subscribing to our newsletter where we break down insights, frameworks, and templates from our guests on each show. To access, go to iorad.com/newsletter. Also, make sure you subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. If you could, we'd also love it if you could leave us a 5-star review if you've enjoyed and got value out of today's conversation. The Adoption Curve is produced by iORAD, the tool that helps thousands of companies make interactive tutorials in seconds. They're shareable in all the tools you use every day. We'll see you on the next episode.